biggest construction projects of World War II. These are the secrets of the Nazi mega-weapons.
The Nazis. They left behind secrets that chill us to the bones, buried under rubble and debris. From musculoskeletal experimentation on young women to the planning and paperwork behind the horrors of gas chambers. They twisted technology and language to hide murder, using euphemism and technical reports to conceal human suffering.
So in the end, 70,273 have been gassed by this method.
How exactly were these methods used? And how did they manage to hide the truth for decades? Watch to find out some of the most terrifying finds of Nazi Germany during World War II. The V-2 rocket. When you hear the word rocket, what comes to your mind? Space travel, right? But for the Germans, the V-2 rocket was a weapon for mass destruction. Let's start with how big this force was. One V-2 rocket was 14 meters long. That's about 45 feet. To put that in perspective, the V-2 was as tall as a 4-story building. It weighed 12,500 kilograms, or 26,700 pounds. The engine of the V-2 rocket was powered by a blazing mixture of alcohol water and liquid oxygen. And how did the Nazi manage to build such a behemoth during the height of the war? Forced labor. Tens of thousands of forced laborers, all civilians from Europe, were put to work by the Nazis. They were tortured, starved, and executed while working on the weapon. At least 10,000 forced laborers died in the process of constructing the V-2. But how could a rocket be used as a weapon? The Germans had it all mapped out. Just blast it into space and then let it fall back to the area of target at an unimaginable speed. Talk about an impact speed of nearly 3,000 kilometers per hour. About 1,402 V.2 rockets were targeted at Britain alone, and more than 1,000 hit their targets, with the majority in London. More than 30,000 civilians perished from V-2 explosions. Another hundreds of thousands became homeless. One of the sites to experience the devastation of the impacts was the Hughes Mansions, located on Valence Road, East London. On March 27, 1945, when the V-2 exploded, the impact was terrifying. Only a few lived to tell the story. It's a story they wish they had never experienced. The British population was left in psychological dismay. Where would be hit next? When will it be? The Germans achieved their aim with the randomness of the strikes. In Belgium, the situation was no different. In Antwerp, hundreds of V-2s rained from the skies every day. On the 16th of December, 1944, one V-2 rocket landed on the roof of Cinema Rex. At the time, over 1,000 people were in the cinema watching the film The Plainsman. 567 perished instantly from this single strike. Many of them were children who had followed their parents to see the film. For the Germans, the V-2 rocket is just a part of the forgotten history of World War II. But for London and Antwerp, that history will never be forgotten. For the record, the V-2 rocket is the world's first large-scale rocket with a liquid propellant and the first long-range ballistic missile ever used. The Holocaust. The Holocaust is perhaps the most talked-about atrocity of the Nazis, and rightly so. Imagine murdering about 6 million Jews within 4 years, from 1941 to 1945. That's the worst genocide the world has ever known. But why did the Nazis hate the Jews so much as to want to wipe them from the surface of the earth? Part of the reason is that when Germany lost the First World War, the Jews received the blame. According to right-wing extremists, the Jews were capitalist exploiters. But just how did this relate to Germany losing the war? No one had a straightforward explanation. The Jews were also accused of being supporters of communism, with the aim of using a revolution to gain dominance over the world. The heat began in 1939, when Polish Jews were expelled from Germany. The remaining ones suffered discrimination, robbery, violence, and exclusion. And it reached boiling point when World War II struck, and the Nazis began to think that they could wipe out all European Jews. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Army Command received a new order from Hitler. War crimes would not be punished, and criminals could be punished and executed without a trial. Jews were starved and killed at will. In fact, a new unit was created, the Einsatzgruppen. The group was tasked with killing communist officials, partisans, and Jewish men between 15 to 60 years old. But the German soldiers went beyond the order, killing women and children. After all, war crimes would not be punished. The military would order Jews in the occupied territories to report to a central location under the pretext of deportation. Then they were taken to a secluded place where they were executed and forgotten. At other times, the Jews were rounded up during raids and whisked away, and none would return home. And just like that, nearly 1 million Jews were murdered in 1941 alone. And as 1941 drew to a close, the Nazis began to make plans for the murder of more than 2 million Jews in the general government, the occupied part of Poland. To carry out this heinous plan, the Nazis established several extermination camps in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These camps were built for just one purpose: killing Jews. So on arrival, there was no time wasted. Jews were executed on arrival. The only Jews who were not killed on arrival were used as instruments to kill the others. The bodies of the victims were then burned, and hide every trace of the camps. After their use, the Nazis planted trees. In 1942, the Nazis began the deportation of Jews from occupied territories in Western Europe. The Jews were transported in overcrowded wagons used for carrying cattle. They were either taken to concentration camps, where they were forced to work under unspeakable conditions, or to extermination centers where they were executed on arrival. From 1943 to 1944, Jews in Italy, Hungary, Greece, and the Balkans were deported. By the end of the war in 1945, nearly 6 million Jews had been executed. And even after the war, countless Jews died from malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease. Musculoskeletal experimentation. During World War I, a severe, life-threatening infection known as gas gangrene occurred in about 12% of wounded German soldiers. 20% of soldiers who had gas gangrene died. The total amount, 100,000 German soldiers. And as World War II raged on, the Nazis found out that their soldiers had developed high-energy battlefield trauma, fractures, severe soft tissue and bone defects, and amputations, which resulted in life-threatening infections, particularly gas gangrene. Again, the Nazis were aware of this and rightly worried. To tackle the situation, SS physicians were recruited from the SS Medical Corps. They were assigned to carry out 2 sets of tests, of musculoskeletal tests, to identify pain, dysfunction, and sources of musculoskeletal issues. First, SS researchers tested whether sulfonylamides could prevent and treat gas gangrene. Next, they experimented on how bones, muscles, and nerves heal, and whether bones or limbs could be transplanted from one person to another. At the Ravensbrück concentration camp, 90 kilometers north of Berlin, by the banks of Lake Ravensbrück, Professor Karl Gerhardt oversaw the gas gangrene sulfanilamide experiments. He was assisted by doctors Fritz Fischer, Rolf Rosenthal, and Gerhard Schiedlowski. Ravensbrück was the largest concentration camp during the war, with about 130,000 women and children passing through it during the war. Those held here as prisoners were from Germany, as well as German-controlled territories in Europe. About 40,000 were Polish and 26,000 were Jewish. Thousands were murdered for medical experimentation. Gebhardt believed that surgery was the best way to treat wound infections. His experiments aimed to find out whether Nazi soldiers should get surgery right away at frontline hospitals or first be treated with sulfonylamides by field doctors and then sent to base hospitals for surgery later. Gebhardt and his team conducted preliminary tests on 20 male prisoners taken from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in Ravensbrück. The aim was to determine how the infections occurred. On the body of the prisoners, Gebhardt cut about 5 to 8 centimeters long and 1 to 1.5 centimeters deep on the outer lower leg, near the peroneus longus muscle. Then he made bacterial cultures mixed with dextrose and placed them into the wound, which was then stitched closed. The preliminary experiments on male prisoners resulted in no serious infections, so Gebhardt and his team turned to women. However, this time, they altered the strains of the bacteria. They added wood shavings, cloth fibers, dirt, and glass fragments into the wounds to hasten the infection process. A mixture of Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Clostridium perfringens, and Clostridium novii was used. 60 Polish women at the Ravensbrück concentration camp were used for this inhumane experiment. The women were used like lab animals. Some of them were given sulfonylamides, antimicrobial agents, but others got nothing. But all the women suffered pain and fever. The drug made no difference. The experiments on the women were carried out more than once, in some cases as many as 8 times, and as a result of the experiment, most of the women were unable to walk anymore. They could only hop. So they were nicknamed the Rabbits of Ravensbrück. Barbara Petrzik was 16 years old at the time. She was the youngest of the Rabbits. In 1942 alone, Gebhardt and his team operated on her 5 times. Although she survived the initial experiments, her life was cut short, painfully. She died from the consequences of the experiments in 1947, at the age of 22. Gassing. In late 1939, the Nazi regime started what they called the euthanasia problem. It's a polite label for the deliberate killing of people with mental and physical disabilities. There were 6 killing centers: Bernburg, Brandenburg, Grafeneck, Hamadar, Hartheim, and Sonnenstein. These centers were set up to murder patients with carbon monoxide that was chemically produced. And when Germany invaded Poland in 1941, mobile killing methods were born. How did this gruesome killing method evolve? The Einsatzgruppen, the group tasked with killing the Jews, soon found their work to be brutal and traumatic. So to avoid the stress of shooting, they used gas vans. The vans were sealed, so engine exhaust filled the cargo hold and suffocated those inside. With these vans, hundreds of thousands were killed, mostly Jews, Roma, and people who were judged as mentally ill. As the search for more efficient ways to kill went on, stationary gas chambers were born. In 1942, the execution centers in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka became the sites for industrial murder. As victims arrived in cattle wagons, they were told they needed to be disinfected in showers, and the showers, gas chambers. They were forced into where carbon monoxide from exhaust ended their life by suffocation. Guards made sure that the chambers were packed tightly because the more people inside, the faster the suffocation. And at Auschwitz, the method was slightly different. In 1941, they used Zyklon B, a pesticide that released cyanide gas when exposed to air. Small amounts of cyanide gas had a devastating effect. With Zyklon B, the Nazis could execute more victims faster than they did with exhaust engines. From 1943 to 1944, thousands were gassed out in Auschwitz. The choices the Nazis made about gas were not only technical, they reflected a cold, bureaucratic logic. Committees and SS officials debated which chemicals were cheap, easy to move, and lethal under crowded conditions. They compared costs, transport, and speed. What followed was a grim merger of engineering and ideology, killing on a schedule, tested and improved like a production line. Gas also changed who felt responsible. For the perpetrators of this evil act, the sealed rooms and vans created a distance since they didn't have to face the victims directly. For planners and engineers, they were only carrying out their duties. This detachment kept the movement going. Years later, survivor accounts, documents, and trials revealed the planning, routine, and paperwork behind it all. Forced labor. When World War II broke out, Germany had just one aim: to take full control of Europe and breed a pure race. As they succeeded in occupying countries, they plundered, and millions of people were abducted to be used as forced laborers. In total, about 20 million people, including women and children, were forced to work under gruesome conditions. About 13 million of these forced laborers worked within Germany. The 7 million worked in German-controlled territories. The laborer was used by the Germans as they pleased. Some worked in the arms industry, producing weapons for the regime. Others worked on construction sites, in agriculture, skilled craft, and in public institutions. And very few were lucky enough to work as domestic workers in private households. Forced labor was nothing to hide. The German law supported it, but the treatment laborers received varied depending on race and religion. Workers from France and the Netherlands were treated with a little less cruelty than those from Poland. And for Jews, no matter where they came from, they met the cruelest treatment. For forced laborers, the chances of survival were minimal. The work conditions were brutal. They were forced to work between 12 and 16 hours a day in factories, mines, farms, or construction projects. And then there was starvation. The laborers were given very little food, not enough to live on, let alone sustain the hard labor. And because of the crowdedness and filthiness of many camps, workers were exposed to sickness and disease, and medication care there was none. To crown it all up, the Germans viewed the laborers not as human beings, but as disposable tools. If you were too weak to work, you were sent to the gas chamber to be done away with. About 2.5 prisoners of war and concentration camp workers in the German Reich did not live to tell their story. When the war was over, those who survived tried to return to their homeland, but upon arrival, they were faced with stigmatization. They were treated as perpetrators and not victims, and in the Soviet Union, they were regarded as traitors, having worked for the enemy. However, for the Germans, it was no big deal. There was no punishment for committing forced labor, and when Germans outside the Reich were accused, they outrightly denied it. For about 6 decades, the cries and demands for former forced laborers to be compensated fell on dead ears. And in 1999, a little relief came. Jewish victim organizations came together to initiate a class action against German companies across Europe. With so much pressure, the companies and the German government were forced to make a payment into a common fund. In turn, a one-time payment was made to former forced laborers who were still alive. Since most of the former slave laborers were dead at the time, only about 1.7 million received the financial compensation. Together, discrimination against blacks. Before World War II, blacks were already used to racial discrimination in Germany. In fact, it was part of everyday life. Getting employment was difficult, and when the Great Depression came, matters only got worse. White German women who married black men were treated as commoners, even slaves, and in some extended families, black people were marginalized. And when Hitler and the Nazi Party came into power in 1933, racism became legal. Why? The Nazis wanted to create a pure race, which they already had a name for, the Aryan race. To the Nazis, Roma, and especially blacks, were not Aryan. While many believed that only Jews were the target of racial laws, the fact is that blacks were equally at the center of it. Blacks were persecuted, marginalized, and isolated. They had faced racism during the Weimar era, which spanned from 1918 to 1933, and the Nazis took discrimination to a whole new level. For example, Hilarius Lari Gilges, a German black dancer and communist activist, was executed by the Nazis on the 20th of June, 1933, just a few months after the Nazis came into power. His body was left on the street, most likely as a sign for others. The racist ideology of the Nazis cut across every aspect of life. No one would give them jobs because their skin color marked them as outcasts. They were fired, evicted, and poverty spread among the blacks. The Nazis even signed new laws that made life more difficult for blacks. In April 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed. The law removed non-Aryan people of non-Aryan descent from the German civil service. And who were the targets of the law? Jews, yes, and blacks. In September 1935, the Nuremberg race laws were announced. People thought the laws were targeted at Jews alone, but in November 1953, it was made clear that the Nuremberg laws applied equally to black people, whom the regime referred to as Neger und ihre Bastard, which means Negroes and their bastards. According to the first of the two Nuremberg race laws, the Reich citizenship law, only a person of German or related blood was considered German, so those who were not German, including blacks, were excluded and stripped of their political rights. And according to the second Nuremberg race law, race mixing was banned. What did that mean? Jews and black people were forbidden to marry or have sexual relations with people of German or related blood. Violation of this law was considered Rassenschande, race defilement. Following these laws, everyone who wanted to marry legally needed first to apply for permission to marry. For interracial couples intending to legalize their union, it was a tug of war. They were turned down. And the reason? Race. Black adults were not the only recipients of the discrimination. Their children suffered too. They were mentally tortured in school. Some got expelled and were unable to finish their education. It was a terrifying time not to be of German or related blood. Bone, muscle, and nerve experiment. They called it research. For the women who lived through it, it was a slow, cruel undoing of their bodies and lives. At Ravensbrück, a concentration camp for women, doctors set up a second round of experiments aimed at repairing bone, muscle, and nerve damage, the kind of injuries soldiers might suffer on the battlefield. On paper, the goal sounded clinical. Learn how bone and limb tissue grow back, test whether bone grafts could be moved from one person to another, and see how nerves might heal. In practice, the work was a string of surgeries performed without consent on prisoners who were otherwise healthy. Many had already been through other brutal experiments, like the gas gangrene and sulfanilamide tests. Physicians such as Professor Gebhardt and his assistant, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, led these operations with help from doctors Fritz Fischer and Herta Oberhäuser. They treated living bodies like raw material. Segments of cortical tibial bone were cut out and implanted into other people's tibias or into the opposite leg of the same patient. Sometimes a piece of fibula was grafted onto a tibia. Muscles were cut away repeatedly in the same places until the legs grew thin and weak. Portions of nerves were sliced out to watch whether they regrew. A few victims even endured attempts to move whole limbs from one person to another, a shocking idea with cruel consequences. One woman, Vladislava Karolevska, survived both the sulfanilamide and the bone experiments and later testified at the doctor's trial. She underwent 6 separate operations. Her name is one small, stubborn point of light in a huge, dark ledger of harm. The doctors presented their findings to fellow physicians. At the third medical conference of the Consulting Physicians of the German Armed Forces in May 1943, they spoke openly about techniques and results. Their reports casually noted that some victims had died. The audience asked technical questions. A few showed moral outrage. That quiet, clinical talk helped make atrocities seem routine. After the war, Leo Alexander, a medical expert for the prosecution and a co-author of what would become the Nuremberg Code, explained how these grafts and surgeries were done. The trials exposed not only the acts themselves, but the mindset behind them, a belief that scientific ends could justify criminal means. The experiments were not accidental cruelty. They were planned, written about, debated, and recorded. The cold language of reports and charts hid the human cost. This history is painful to hear, but it must be told. It shows how science, when stripped of ethics, can become a tool of harm. It also explains why rules like informed consent and clear limits on experiments are not technicalities. They are the backbone of humane medicine. Remembering these events honors the people who suffered and died, and it keeps alive a simple lesson. skill and knowledge are not enough. They must be married with respect for human life. Without that respect, expertise can be turned into a weapon.